What is porn studies?
It's examination of the various media, kinds of media that take sex as the primary focus.
How would you define the object of the study?
Well, it's difficult, right? Because actually there are ways in which porn studies can cover a whole range of materials that aren't necessarily marketed or produced primarily as pornographic, but, you know, through usage, through the fact that they break certain taboos or boundaries, they're considered to be porn studies, or pornographic. Well, I mean, it's, you know, there's a kind of, the idea that we can know with any certainty, or that you can look at something and say immediately that's pornographic, is, well, I have a bit of a problem with that, really. And what does it mean? Are we talking about a mode of kind of engaging with something, finding it sexually arousing, for example? I mean, does that make something pornographic, or is it that arouses strong emotions like disgust? Because, you know, politicians and law enforcement seem to know porn when they see it, right? And
what topics would be covered by porn studies?
Looking at how audiences talk about pornography, how they engage with it, how they feel that sexually explicit materials mean something to them. There's also, you know, historical investigations, people looking at sexually explicit literature from the 19th century, for example, or recently we've had an article which examines kind of racist tropes in Finnish pornography. You know, so there's a wide range of things looking at the textual formations of porn, but also audiences and production histories, and then the context in which those might operate. So, yeah, I mean, the idea is that the journal will be a site for investigation of porn across a whole range of dimensions, right? And, yeah, we're not in the one thing that we don't do is debate whether or not porn should exist, right? It does. That can't be changed overnight or, you know, anytime soon. And therefore, you know, looking at it in all its multifacets and from a variety of perspectives is what we do in the journal. Yeah.
Why is it important to do that?
Well, there are a variety of reasons why it's really important. Number one, so many people get very upset about the idea that porn exists, right? It's a key reason for thinking about, well, why does it exist, given that so many lawmakers and moralists and others think that it's a dreadful thing. The fact that people complain that it has impacts on people, you know, from all kinds of things, from you know, changing the shape of people's brains through to ruining marriages and stuff. But also, you know, it's a way in which people have told stories about sex and sexuality over the, you know, past couple of 100 years that we've had media. And as we've had more accessible media, every time there's a more accessible media, someone makes porn via it, right? Or makes some kind of sexually explicit representation, or they want to make representations of sex using whatever media is available, and you know, that's important to examine because it doesn't stay the same just because, you know, it's not ahistorical. There, you know, like cinema, like any other media form, there are really interesting histories, trajectories, ways of relating to materials, tell stories about broader culture and about the place of us as humans in that culture, right? So, yeah, it's important. There's an argument that porn is, it's based on the idea of the slippery slope of the emotions, right? Which gets brought into play whenever anybody is complaining about kinds of activities that will lead inevitably into degradation and the end of civilization. So people talk about drugs and alcohol in the same way, you know, that once you've engaged in smoking weed, for example, you know, it's a non-stop expressway to heroin addiction and death. And when people talk about pornography, it's, you know, looking at girly mags, and then the slippery slope is that you go straight from, you know, topless shots down to child porn and bestiality and all the rest of it. And that's the kind of idea. But of course, that isn't how our engagements with these things work, right? And one of the things about talking about porn as a slippery slope is that it refuses to see that it's an agentic activity, you know, that people make choices and discriminations about the kinds of porn they want to view or listen to or read or whatever, and that, like any other media form, there are ways of choosing and interacting and engaging with that material, right? So, you know, but when you talk about it as a slippery slope, then it's like porn is a thing that acts on an individual rather than, you know, an engagement. So you're powerless to resist in a way, I guess, is the ways that gets talked about. You know, that mustn't find any of this stuff amusing or actually suggest that people might be having fun with porn, because there's always somebody else said, see, they just don't care about the people whose lives are ruined, you know, that's, yeah. And it's not that I don't care, it's that actually I don't know why that's the only narrative.
Why did you decide to do porn studies?
I left university and worked for a while, and then I went back to university after 10 years, after a decade, to do my MA. And as part of the MA, which was on women's studies, we'd had some lectures about pornography. And those lectures were all about the sex wars, and from a perspective that actually porn is a priori a feminist issue, and the only question to ask really is how will we remove this, right? That actually is the ultimate goal. And I found there was so much outside of that just wasn't explained by those kinds of approaches. I found there was such a disconnect between the fact that there's publishers intending to launch magazines, which they did a couple of months later. 6 of them were launched around the same time. Black lace novels, which are erotic or sexually explicit novels aimed at women. Things like the Chippendales, you know, all of those things that actually were speaking to an erotic sensibility in women. Maybe not all women, but a sufficient number that, you know, there was going to be profitability. And I just thought it's really fascinating. So that became my MA dissertation, then was expanded to be my PhD. And then, you know, once you're on this particular track, this is the slippery slope, right? That's where you end up in a particular research trajectory. There is so much that still remains to be researched. It just feels like, you know, yeah, this is a really rich theme to be mined, actually, in terms of trying to understand the importance of porn.
This claim comes with these new productions of like showing the real sex, or phrasing it as like we show real people with real sex. Like it could happen to you.
Yeah.
Like
porn isn't the only industry that kind of thinks about authenticity all the time. You know, you can find that in popular music as well, right? Where, you know, yes, this rapper is from the streets. No, this one grew up on, you know, in some nice little suburb and has had an easy life. You know, those are distinctions that are made as well across, you know, the divisions between boy bands and proper musicians and all of the rest of it. So, yeah, authenticity is really, it's an authenticating discourse around porn, right? And I think there are differences between the notions of authenticity in different kinds of pornography. Ultimately, I don't know that it's important to decide whether or not, you know, this authenticity is true or it's just marketing. I think it can be both and, you know, and that actually it's not necessarily whether or not this is a true representation or this is a real one or it's a good one or any of those things, but what is being attempted. What are people attempting to achieve by using the term authenticity? That's more interesting to me to understand why. Because a feminist porn producer is using authenticity differently from, say, Max Hardcore, right? I mean, really significantly differently. But both of them mean something by their use of that term. So examining what the differences are between those two, not to adjudicate which is better or worse, but in actual fact just to understand what authenticity means both to that producer and to the people they're selling their products to. So on one level, you're actually seeing, you're getting all of the action, it's authentically sex, what you're seeing, right? But it may well be highly performed, athletic kinds of sex that you're not, you know, you the viewer are not going to get in your everyday life, but it's real and it's really happening and it's on camera now. That's one kind of authenticity, and then there's the other kind which I think is very much tied up with femme porn and porn for women, which is, you know, these are real people with real emotions who are really, you know, engaging and having a great time together, and it's not scripted and it's real, and, you know, this is lovely, and of course there's markets for both of those things, right? That yeah, there's a kind of one person's authentic is another person's really boring.
Which porn film would you recommend to watch and why?
I'm going to go with Blacklight Beauty, actually. That's the one I'm going to go with, which is by a guy called Jack the Zipper. And I've written about that film, and so, yeah, and I find it really intriguing.
What's
I think
interesting
he has a number of performers in the vignettes. You know, it's kind of standard fare in a straightforward description of it. I think it's about 6-7 vignettes, scenes, mostly mainstream stars. However, the music that's used, the visuals, the camera work, it's all, you know, quite experimental, and there are some amazing performances in there. And I think also it's commentary on the idea of the grindhouse experience of the 1970s, that kind of, there is a way, I think, in which he's commenting on the possibilities of porn as this really high-octane activity, and he really doesn't want things to look like it's authentically anybody could have this kind of sex, right? It really is about, there are certain people who can have sex like this, and the rest of us can probably only watch. You've really thrown me with that one. What is porn studies?